All right, we're joined by Annie Costabile, who on Thursday night broke the WNBA shattering news that Teresa Weatherspoon, the Chicago Sky, was fired. I don't think anybody saw this coming. Maybe you saw it coming as somebody who's in the know, but Teresa Weatherspoon, after a really, dramatic season that had basically everything you can have happen in the course of 40 games, was let go by the Chicago Sky. Annie, what were your initial thoughts? And I guess my first question was, did you see this coming?
Yeah, there were definitely, I shouldn't say signs throughout the season, but it was clear throughout the season that this was not a successful team by any means. And of course, they were dealing with injuries. So you're factoring that in. You're also factoring the fact that Teresa, this was her first year as a head coach in the WNBA. So the learning curve of it all, you're thinking, okay, she's at least got one more year. Because the thing that I kept going back to was the Sky knowingly hired an inexperienced head coach. When you do that, you're, without saying it, saying we're signing you up to 2 years, right? Because again, when you go into a hiring like that, you guys brought this person in who lacked experience in a head coaching role. And so, again, applying that to the season we saw unfold, you're thinking, okay, well, this wasn't a great season by any stretch of the imagination. But again, she's got at least one more year to try this out. So, I mean, of course, for my job, when you're following a year like this, you've got to ask those things. So the season ends and you're checking on the status of everyone's position, because again, it wasn't a successful season. So even though in the back of your mind, you're thinking, well, there's got to be a second year to this thing, you still got to ask. And so once I started kind of imploring about whether or not everybody was on stable ground, it wasn't an immediate answer of no. But I wasn't entirely shocked by this news. No.
Well, I mean, you mentioned, it wasn't a successful season. And I guess my question would be what measure of success was the ownership group using? Because when you do hire a brand new coach, first year as a head coach for Teresa Weatherspoon, you have 2 draft picks coming in Angel Reese and Camila Cardoso. This is a rebuild, right? So I guess my question, is just when you have those players and you have this season where, they only had 2 games where everybody was fully healthy, and you have a lot of fiery personalities in that locker room. And the one thing that Teresa, I think, did incredibly well was connect with everybody in that locker room, whether it was building trust with Camila Cardoso, instilling confidence in Angel Reese, just really unlocking Kennedy Carter, who, has come out and said the reason that she had such a successful season was because she felt so trusted by Teresa Weatherspoon. Angel Reese herself said that, after the firing, said that she was heartbroken. This is definitely somebody who had an ability to connect with players. I felt like probably her strongest suit was just the ability to probably I can't even imagine what it's like being in the locker room there, the Coach Carter of all of it. This is somebody who is, you could see it in post game press conferences too. One thing I think I'll always look back at was the amount of tearful press conferences there were, the amount of times that, the coaches and players got kind of emotional together, whether it was Angel Reese or whether it was Kennedy Carter going in for a hug, and you saw her face melt. You saw somebody who, I think has a bit of a hardened exterior in front of the media, just completely cheekbones are drooping, and not in just in a way of she felt very relaxed and safe in the presence of this coach. And I don't think that Teresa Weatherspoon was a perfect coach by any means, but I guess I did kind of leave the season thinking that she was a perfect coach for this particular team, because it's a rebuild, because I think the most important thing with young players is instilling that confidence, even if there is a bit of a lack of structure. So I guess it just takes me back to the original question, what was the measure of success for the Chicago Sky this season?
You know what? I think that's one of their biggest issues, is that the Sky has yet to come out and even define that. And I know teams historically, whatever league you're talking about, teams don't ever really openly admit to the quote unquote rebuild or tear down or whatever the phrase that we all use in the media, like that's usually not coming directly from a coach or directly from a GM in press conferences, unless things, I guess, get to a point where, yeah, you can see the success in acknowledging that's where you're at. And I think that's been the biggest issue, or one of the biggest issues for the Sky of late, is they have not openly acknowledged the direction that they're going in. Mm-hmm. And I think that's in large part due to two things. I think one, the rebuild was attempted to be diverted by former coach and general manager James Wade when he pulled the trigger on that trade for Marina Mabrey. Like James, what people need to like look back when we look back and analyze James Wade as a coach and a GM. First of all, he was the last operating coach and GM in professional basketball. Okay. So that speaks to just the fact that he maybe shouldn't even have been put in that position. He did it successfully for a long time. And then when he made that trade for Marina Mabrey, it wasn't necessarily the best move. And quite frankly, it wasn't. Like you gave up all your draft picks, but more so to that, it reflected his style. James Wade never built through the draft. During his tenure with the Sky, he never built through the draft. You could look back at the players he built his roster around. It was always around vets. It was always around players he went and got overseas. It was around players that maybe other teams let go, and then he saw something in them. He knew that they had the experience, the talent to build around. Like Alana Smith is one of them. She wasn't playing in the league. He brings her back. Now she's on the second W's second all defensive team. So anyways, James attempted to divert that rebuild, right? He goes and gets another player who he sees as someone you could build around, Marina Mabrey. Like, this is a young player who's going to step into her prime. We want her to step into her prime in Chicago. Well, he leaves midseason. Again, it forces the Sky down a path that they didn't outwardly choose. Okay. And so then you come into this year and you've got this new GM and coach tandem. Well, Teresa was hired first. Jeff was hired second. And I think we're starting to see about Jeff's style is he too is trying to go around a full-on rebuild. Like the way that he's acquired these draft picks is not necessarily because he's going to stockpile all this young talent with Sky. He's trying to maybe use these in trades, whatever, to bring other players here. And so again, when you're not outwardly acknowledging your place and that it is, you're in the midst of this, whether chosen or not, rebuild, it kind of, it takes away any acknowledgement of, what success looks like. And so I think the Sky firing Teresa after such an unsuccessful season is again a message of, we're not trying to stay down. The problem with that is you don't have the reputation necessarily to flip this quickly. And that's more what the Sky are trying to claw their way back from, is a reputation that is necessary to execute a quick turnaround. And how do you clean up a reputation that, league-wide is just not great?
Yeah, I mean, that's actually something I was thinking about. Like when I was trying to muster up reasonable justifications, I was wondering if the Sky just maybe decided they wanted to try to win now with Angel and Camilla, and some of the weaker points with Teresa, whether it's, play calling, rotations, some of the more hard skills of being a WNBA coach is maybe just something that they no longer had the patience for her to figure out how to do that.
But again, that's like you went out and chose this coach. Right. You went out and chose a coach who did not have these skill sets built in yet.
Yeah, completely.
And you went after her because of her soft skills. And so now a year later, 11 months later, you've determined those aren't good enough. Well, to me, that says there's more to it.
Go on.
I think that this year it was visible at times that the locker room was not the happiest of places. And I think at the end of the season that became apparent in exit interviews, even in the way that players were saying without saying, that this was a very challenging year. And I think as a media member, that's kind of our job, right? Like people often, people talk about all the time, like, oh, there's a million ways to do this job. Well, I think one of the most important skill sets in this job is observing underlying messages that are being shared with you. And I think one of the most important lessons I've ever been given in this industry, or most important messages I've ever been told, is that just because someone's saying something doesn't make it true. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, again, I don't have the direct quote in front of me right now, but one of Dana Evans' last quotes was talking about how social media impacted the locker room at times this season. And yes, there was a specific moment in this press conference. She was talking directly about the harassment that players were receiving. But there was another part of her quote where she was just talking about kind of what people are saying about players, then getting into the locker room and disrupting the locker room energy. And so again, as a coach, if that's what players are saying in a press conference, that's only the tip of the iceberg, right? So because again, players usually don't ever want to let on to what's kind of happening behind closed doors. That's something that usually stays pretty close to the vest. So again, if it's coming out in these little sprinkles, there's definitely something more to that.
So was this a situation where, and I think going back to those exit interviews, like you wrote a great column where you also quoted Angel Reese saying that, one of her critiques for Teresa Weatherspoon was like that you were too nice this year. And knowing that she's going to try to be more stern, like it feels like she went from being, she was definitely a player's coach, but then when you think about what's necessary in year 2, was she going to be able to be the coach that was then willing to divert some of those touches away from Angel Reese? Because I do think that's like the natural evolution of the Chicago offense, right, especially as Camila Cardoso in the second half of the year just showed how much she's able to do, how efficient she is when she gets a touch. I also will add that it's kind of hard to make an entry pass when you have no spacing. So that's on the front office. What's that?
I said, no, it's not the easiest thing.
No, it's not the easiest thing. They definitely this is a team that lacks both spacing and playmaking, which doesn't, serve a player like Cardoso, who I do think is like offensively the future of this team. But, there was a lot of criticism this year too of like, the favoring of Angel Reese on offense, like the double chasing, which, frankly, like it is a very toxic conversation. So I think sometimes we get a little bit protective and defensive. It's true. It was happening. Like you could see it. Like, like there were other teams that were helping facilitate it. There was one game against Vegas before the break where it was right before the break where, like Kennedy Carter ties her career high with like minutes left to go in the game. She is incredible in the clutch in general. And the ball should have been in her hands and it wasn't. And it just immediately started diverting its way to Angel Reese, and Angel Reese finishes with a double-double. Those things were happening. And they happen in the NBA too. Like Russell Westbrook. Like these things happen across sports. But yeah, I guess like maybe it was like maybe that's like sort of like the dark side, or like the other side of when you are a player's coach, right? Like it becomes a little bit harder to have those difficult conversations and make like the necessary transitions.
Right. And also like when you're a player's coach, because again, like there's no taking away from how appreciated Teresa was specifically by players like Angel and Kennedy. I mean, that's like one of her greatest attributes. I've never been around somebody who just naturally has such a skill at firing everybody up. Like even in the media, you're like listening to her talk, and I mean, she is an incredible motivator. Like that is, and that's a skill. That's a valued skill as a coach. But again, to your point, there comes when you're a coach that is building such an identity around like your players' trust and being essentially family. I mean, she talked about these players like they're her kids a lot of times. So it's like, what happens then when you've got to have these difficult conversations? When again, the locker room starts to break apart. It's like, are you able to rally everybody, or is your immediate move to go and rally the players you're closest to? It's like, these are all things that factor into the success of a coach. And again, these are things I don't even have all the answers to at this point, as far as like what exactly went on and whether or not, Teresa was extremely successful at doing that. I think, again, based on Angel and Kennedy's responses, you see that she was successful in rallying these two players.
Mm-hmm.
But again, it's about the collective. It's about the team. And just going back to, again, those intangible qualities, right? The ability to rally, the ability to motivate, the ability to instill confidence in young players. It's like, well, you've also got a team of veterans who need you to execute for them, who need structure, who need, successful play calling. Like we said, all of these things matter too. So it's a balancing act. It's a balancing act. And the fact that, again, after 11 months, she was let go, speaks to both, again, the Sky's inability to establish an identity or a direction of where they want things to go, and a timeline even for that matter. But also the fact that they were unwilling to even bet on a second year, that says a lot.